My name is Erin. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Hey everyone, welcome back to the history behind the crime. So first I want to apologize for another lapse between episodes. I did have an episode ready and I had recorded it and I started editing it, but the content even made me yawn and the sound was so off, so I chucked it. And maybe I'll revisit that later on and maybe put it somewhere in next season. Because the sound was so bad, this is the second recording of this episode. I decided I wanted to record from my dining room and there was a really bad echo. And now I'm recording from my closet. I'm on the closet floor and I'm holding the microphone. It's kind of it's kind of interesting. So I'm hoping that the sound works out. Second, I wanted to share this because it happened last week. I had been chatting with a guy from a dating app. He seemed nice enough. There were no red flags, which in and of itself should have been a red flag. He really liked dogs, and he did not make one sexual comment. Once again, that alone should have been a red flag. It was like I had stumbled upon a unicorn. I asked if he wanted to meet for coffee, and he was so on board. He seemed excited about it. 2 hours before the date, I messaged him to confirm. He said, yeah, he was looking forward to it. I spent some extra time getting ready, did the moisturizing thing. I plucked every stray hair I could find off of my face. I put on makeup. I did the hair thing, and I even put on jewelry. Y'all, I looked good. And I showed up a little early for coffee because I didn't know where the coffee place was. I grabbed a cup of coffee. I sat down and I waited. And I waited. And I waited. I finally pulled up the dating app, only to find out that he had blocked me. He wasn't a unicorn. He was a jackass. Of course, the first text I sent was to my sister and my mom. My mom promptly put a hex on the guy. My mother, my good Christian, God-fearing mother, actually cursed this guy that all 4 of his tires would go flat. And apparently she's pulled a little stunt like this before and it worked. After chatting with some friends, making some Hungarian goulash, and cuddling with my dogs, I'm over it. But I do want to offer a bit of advice for all my dating listeners out there. If you're having second thoughts about a date, just cancel. Bone up the courage and just say, hey, I'm not really sure about this. I'm going to cancel. The best of luck to you. Then you can block them. The least you are doing is saving them some time. I mean, if this a-hole had canceled, I could have spent the morning reading a book in my PJs. Man, people are dicks. So a few episodes ago, I asked for listener episode suggestions, and a very nice listener, Hannah from Texas, suggested I talk about something that appealed to the historian in me rather than the true crime enthusiast. Now, I'm pretty sure Hannah was trying to get me to do a historical crime, but something else immediately popped to mind. I told a friend about it, and they suggested that I do not do an episode about this crime because the events surrounding it are so controversial and would upset a lot of people. I thought about it. I did. I took some time and I contemplated it. But I'm okay if people get upset about it. They should. I'm certainly okay if this episode garners hate mail, or if I even lose a few listeners, or even if I lose all my listeners. That's just fine with me. One of the toughest parts about being a historian is trying to be unbiased. Sometimes you have to shove your personal opinions to the side in order to accurately record what's going on. For the most part, I've been kind of successful in doing this in my career because it's my job, and serious people rely on me to report the facts without personal interference. That being said, this is my personal podcast, and I can pretty much say whatever I want. And I normally do. This is one of those episodes where you will have no doubt how I feel about something or where I stand. But I do have a few rules for this episode. The first, don't believe a word I say. Number 2, do the research yourself. Number 3, take a moment to step back from yourself and your own biases. Number 4, come to a conclusion that makes the most sense to you. And number 5, email or message me your thoughts on the subject. You can email me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or message me on Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. This episode is about history, hate, and murder. On the evening of June 17th, 2015, a young man entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and joined a Bible study already in progress. The church was one of the oldest black churches in the United States and was historically known to host civil rights events. The members were welcoming to the newcomer and embraced him as any good Christian would. That was until he pulled a .45 caliber Glock handgun and started shooting people with hollowed point bullets from the 8 magazines he had prepared. The group was praying when he fired the first shots. As he pulled the trigger, he said, "I have to do it. You rape our women and you're taking over our country, and you have to go." He called the church members racial epithets and reloaded his gun 5 times during the attack. The gunman put the pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, but the gun was empty, so he walked away, leaving death behind him. The man killed 9 people who had previously welcomed him to their group. 59-year-old Myra Thompson, 45-year-old Sharonda Coleman Singleton, 74-year-old Daniel L. Simmons, 26-year-old Tywanza Sanders, 49-year-old DePayne Middleton Doctor, 7-year-old Ethel Lee Lance, 87-year-old Susie Jackson, 54-year-old Cynthia Graham Hurd, and 41-year-old Reverend Clementa C. Pickney, who was the church's pastor and a state senator. The shooter's own father and his uncle identified him to police after they had seen his picture on TV, and law enforcement tracked down and arrested the offender the next day in North Carolina. What they found was a self-radicalized white supremacist whose intent was to start a race war. He was fueled by hate and false tropes about Black Americans. He was tried and convicted of murder and hate crimes in both state and federal court. The state sentenced him to life without parole, and the federal government sentenced him to death. He also failed in his attempts to start a race war. In fact, in the following days, the opposite happened. Thousands came together to mourn the loss of those who died. President Barack Obama eulogized at Reverend Pickney's funeral, and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley demanded that the Confederate flag be removed from the State House and other government buildings after hundreds of thousands of people demanded an end to the flying of the flag, and people across the South started to demand the removal of Confederate statues from publicly owned areas. It was this last demand that sparked more violence. Statues. I love statues. I appreciate the time and the talent it takes to make a statue, whether out of granite or marble or metal or even clay or wood. Throughout my childhood, I can remember looking up at some of these statues and thinking, hey, that's pretty cool. This must have been a really important person. I've spent hours looking at Lincoln sitting in his big chair at the Lincoln Memorial. I got a bit teary-eyed when I looked across the harbor at the Statue of Liberty, and I felt a little choked up when I went to Mount Rushmore and Crazy Horse. There were other statues that made me feel the opposite, like the huge Christopher Columbus Memorial in Barcelona, and I took great joy on spitting on it. I have a friend who actually flipped off his tomb, which is located in a cathedral. Statues can be marvelous pieces of art and can give you a sense of pride. There are also wonderful ways to memorialize somebody for doing something great or honorable. At least, something that was considered honorable at the time. Too many times to count have I been asked if, as a historian, I think history disappears when a statue is, removed or demolished or taken down. The short answer is quite simply no. The long answer is as follows. Very rarely does the erection of a statue have anything to do with history. Statues, memorials, and such are about memorialization. It's about honoring someone or something. Statues are about society and not history. Simply put, statues and memorials have been erected and raised to the ground since the beginning of humankind. In the 1st century AD, hundreds upon hundreds of statues were erected to honor Nero. All hail Caesar, right? But after his death, most of them were destroyed because people thought he was a huge asshole. The same is true with Stalin. During his, I guess we can call it reign, there were lots of statues and murals of him because people of the Soviet Union either really loved him or they were terrified of him. However, after his death, his cult of personality died, and the murals were painted over and his statues were either destroyed or taken away. And I recommend reading Monumental Propaganda by Vladimir Voinovich. It's a historical fictional satire that shows the absurdity of Stalin's statues. One of the points I'm trying to make is that most of Nero's statues were destroyed before any of us were born. Most of Stalin's statues were destroyed before most of us were born. Yet most of us know who Nero and Stalin were. The history of these two men did not disappear because our knowledge of them did not come from their statues, but from history books or documentaries. The same is true about Confederate statues. No one is going to forget about Robert E. Lee if we take down all the statues and memorials erected in his honor. It's not even going to happen over the course of 100 years. His deeds live on not in granite, but in books and documentaries and classes and movies, as are the deeds of Stonewall Jackson, Longstreet, and Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. Plus, these books and documentaries give more context to these men's lives rather than a plaque that reads, in honor of this guy born on this date and died on this date who did this thing. My other point that I was trying to make is that statues are a marker of society. We put statues up to recognize someone doing something we think is honorable. We've erected a monument in Washington's honor for leading the Continental Army against the British and becoming the first president of the United States. There's another one in Thomas Jefferson's honor for writing the Declaration of Independence and being the third president. We built these things because we thought what these men did were awesome achievements, and we still think that. In the South, statues of Confederate generals were erected to honor the men who led the South in rebellion. During the turn of the century, when most of these statues were built, this was an honorable achievement. But many in society changed their minds after a course of a century. For some, they view these men as white supremacists who fought to preserve the institution of slavery. For others, they see these men as traitors to the United States. These men are no longer considered heroes in the eyes of many Americans. History did not change, but society's perception of history did change. For most people, taking down or removing a statue is not about erasing or changing history, but refusing to honor someone who you believe did something wrong. And I know some of you may be asking, but what about Washington and Jefferson? They owned slaves. Yes, they did. But they are not honored for owning slaves or preserving the institution of slavery. They are honored for fighting for and preserving this country's independence. Robert E. Lee is not honored for fighting in the Mexican-American War, but for leading an insurrection against the Union. He was a brilliant tactician, he was a brilliant general, but in the end, he was a traitor. Why do I make this argument? Mainly because I want to and have a platform where I can, but also because after the shooting in Charleston, hundreds of thousands of people in the South had the same argument and wanted these statues to come down or to be moved off of public land. There were also some people who wanted the statues to remain for their own personal reasons. Some of these people didn't do it because they thought they were preserving history, but because of what the statues represented: white power. Racists. We've talked about them before on this podcast. In fact, it was one of the main topics in the first episode. But that was racism in the 1980s and 90s. Those were white separatists and skinheads and anti-government paramilitary guys that most of the country turned their noses up at. No decent American really wanted to be associated with them because they were seen as coarse and ignorant. Times changed. In the 2010s, a new group was making itself known in certain online circles before they really gained steam during President Trump's tenure. And no, I am so not going to hark on the political thing during the episode. All I'm going to say is that these people saw the president as an ally, whether if he was or wasn't. Anyway, these groups were different. Many of them were well-spoken, clean-cut, and did not look a thing like skinheads. In fact, many of them preferred khakis and polo shirts or nice suits as opposed to shaved heads, swastika tattoos, and metal chains. They spoke at universities and church groups, and they were known as the alt-right. They didn't think of themselves as white supremacists, but as white nationalists, which honestly is just really splitting hairs. They were worried that America's white, European culture was disappearing because Jews were taking over and white women weren't having enough children and black people were producing more quickly than white people. They also worried increased immigration was destroying white culture. They pretty much preached the same old racist song and dance, but they just dressed nicer and used fancy language, which is how they managed to go mainstream. I got the following from Center on Extremism, and it's a little bit wordy, but it's a good overview of what was going on here. The alt-right's ideological sources are as mixed as its subcultural influences. One of the most straightforward influences is paleoconservatism, reflected most clearly in Richard Spencer, his National Policy Institute, and his followers. Paleoconservatism is an obscure segment of the American right that seeks not only limited government and traditional values, but also return to older, less enlightened attitudes on subjects such as race, religion, ethnicity, and gender. Another ideological influence of the alt-right is neo-Nazism. Neo-Nazis are white supremacist groups that revere Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany and adopt many of the same trappings, symbology, and mythology of the Third Reich. Neo-Nazis also adopt its extreme anti-Semitism. There's also identitarians, who mainly believe white European culture is best, and you need to keep out the Muslims and Africans to keep it pure. Identity Europa is the largest identitarian alt-right group, claiming its objective is to create a better world for people of European descent, particularly in America. Like Spencer, with whom it was initially aligned with, Identity Europa also takes an interest in conservative politics. In an article posted to its site after some of its members attended the 2018 Conservative Political Action Conference, Patrick Casey, the group's leader, urged his followers to become active in politics by joining the college Republicans or running for office. Trump has given us an opportunity, Casey wrote, to transform the GOP from a vehicle for conservatism to one for nationalism, and it's up to us to seize the opportunity, which in and of itself is kind of frightening, especially for conservative Republicans who are not racists and embrace people of different cultures, faiths, and races. Why do I bring these shitbirds up? Because, like their granddaddies like to do when they were part of the Klan, they like to throw parties and rallies, and Charlottesville, Virginia was ground zero. The Robert E. Lee Monument in Charlottesville, Virginia was dedicated in 1924, nearly 60 years after the end of the Civil War, and the park it was erected upon was donated to the city and named Lee Park. After the murders in Charleston, there was a push in Charlottesville to have the statue removed and the park renamed. Of course, there was also a significant amount of people who wanted the statue to stay. And some of those people are wonderful, fine, everyday people who just happen to have different opinions than the other side, which is great. We're not talking about them in this podcast. We're talking about white supremacists. In February 2017, the City Council voted to remove the statue, but a court order stopped the removal of the bronze statue. The case ping-ponged back and forth between the court system and the Charlottesville City Council, and the case garnered national attention, including the attention of Richard Spencer, founder of the National Policy Institute and self-proclaimed neo-Nazi. On the evening of May 13th, 2017, Spencer and about 100 other alt-right protesters showed up in Charlottesville to march in support of keeping the statue right where it was. They walked around with tiki torches, because I guess they were safer than real torches, and were yelling things like "Jews will not replace us" and other racist tropes, which reminded townfolk of the KKK marches in the decades past. The next evening, hundreds of anti-Nazi and anti-fascist protesters came out en masse to protest the alt-right and showed support for the removal of the statue with a candlelit vigil. And yes, I can see the confusion of why one is deemed unacceptable while the other is considered an acceptable vigil. My only guess is that because one group was chanting anti-Semitic verbiage and the other wasn't. Throughout the spring and summer of 2017, Charlottesville was ground zero for the alt-right and anti-Nazi, anti-fascist groups. It wasn't just because of the statue, of course. The statue, it was a trigger for both of these groups. Charlottesville hosted many different people that summer, including a KKK group from North Carolina in July. Their presence was the reason over 1,000 counter-protesters showed up in the city and shouted down the KKK. After the North Carolina group gave up and started to retreat, the police attempted to disperse the remaining crowd. Unfortunately, due to confusion on both the police and protester side, many did not hear the order to disperse, and police fired tear gas into the crowd. Many leaders of many alt-right and neo-Nazi and fascist groups wanted a bigger rally, a rally where they could outnumber counter-protesters. Some tried to organize an organized rally that other white Americans could relate to and perhaps support their cause, while other organizers wanted to use the event to do some damage, and these groups didn't communicate very well. The following list came from multiple sources and was compiled by our favorite online encyclopedia. Among the far-right groups engaged in organizing the march were the Stormer Book Club of the neo-Nazi news website, the Daily Stormer, the Right Stuff, the National Policy Institute, and 4 groups that formed the Nationalist Front, the Neo-Confederate League of the South, Identity Dixie, and the neo-Nazi groups Traditionalist Worker Party, Vanguard America, and the National Socialist Movement. Other groups involved in the rally were the Ku Klux Klan, obviously, the Fraternal Order of Alt-Knights, the neo-Nazi white supremacist group Identity Europa, the Southern California-based, I shit you not, Fight Club, Rise Above the Movement, the American Guard, the Detroit Right Wings, which do not confuse that with the Detroit Red Wings. That NHL team sued this group for use of the team's logo. True Cascadia, which is Canadian-based, Hammer Brothers, and Anti-Communist Action. In attendance included Spencer, entertainer and internet troll Baked Alaska, former Libertarian Party candidate Augustus Invictus, former Ku Klux Klan Imperial Wizard and asshole himself, David Duke, Identity Europa leader Nathan Domingo, Traditionalist Workers' Party leader Matthew Himbach, and it goes on and on and on. I just don't want to read all these because, dear God, there's a lot of them. Anyways, numerous armed right-wing militia groups were also present at the rally, claiming to be there to protect First Amendment rights. Groups included Pennsylvania Lightfoot Militia, the New York Lightfoot Militia, the Virginia Minutemen Militia, the Three Percenters, and on and on and on. It was pretty much the who's who of extreme right-wing, anti-Semitic, racist people. And they called the rally Unite the Right. Word did leak out about the rally. I mean, they did have to apply for permits. It was going to happen sooner or later. And counter-protests were planned. Counter-protesters included many faith-based organizations. Representatives from the National Council of Churches were there, Black Lives Matter, Anti-Racist Action, the Democratic Socialists of America, the Workers' World Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, Refuse Fascism, Redneck Revolt, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, and Showing Up for Racial Justice. Members of the Antifa movement were also in attendance. Yes, some counter-protesters came armed as well. Let's not be stupid or biased here. Of course, far-left groups came for trouble as well. Counter-protesters were pretty much the moderate all the way to the extreme left. And the alt-right protesters were very, very much far-right. It was a Godzilla and Mothra showdown, just waiting to happen. On the evening of August 11th, the day before the Unite the Right rally, about 200 neo-Nazis, Klan members, and other alt-right men dressed wearing anything from khakis and polo shirts to black t-shirts with swastikas on it, marched through the University of Virginia campus, chanting the usual "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil," which is a Nazi slogan, all the while carrying around tiki torches. The group marched to the statue of Thomas Jefferson and encountered a small band of students encircled around the statue with locked arms. And of course, a fight erupted. The alt-right attacked with their torches, and the counter-protesters had pepper spray. But the police broke up the fight, and only minor injuries occurred. The same could not be said of the next day. On August 12th, both rally participants and counter-protesters showed up at Emancipation Park, which was formerly known as Lee Park and is today known as Market Park. They all showed up at around 8 a.m., even though the rally wasn't scheduled for until noon. The presence of armed men in fatigues shouting anti-Semitic statements outside the synagogue, Beth Israel, forced Saturday morning congregants to flee out the back of the synagogue with the Torah scrolls just in case, because there had been online chatter encouraging protesters to burn the synagogue down. As the day began to pass, the crowd grew larger, with both alt-right groups chanting racist, misogynistic, and anti-Semitic tropes, while the other side either held hands and prayed or shouted things back like, "Punch the Nazis in the mouth," or "Kill all the Nazis." People in both groups had weapons. Many of the alt-right and the counter-protesters carried firearms openly, which was both their constitutional and state right. Obviously, fights broke out. Both sides beat each other with sticks and batons, sprayed chemical propellant such as bear spray at each other, and a Klan member shot at a counter-protester after that protester ignited an aerosol spray at the Klan members. It was chaos. Pure and simple chaos. And you may be asking, where were the cops in all this? They were there, disorganized, and outnumbered by 1,500 people caught up in the brutality. By 11 a.m., a whole hour before the rally was supposed to begin, the city council declared a state of emergency. At around 11:30, the police declared the entire thing an illegal assembly and a riot because of the violence. And by noon, the Virginia governor declared a state of emergency. Some people went home. Some did not. Because of the overwhelmed police presence, there was a lack of police presence at certain areas where the protesters congregated. They began to march onto streets initially blocked off but left unguarded. At around 1:45, a Dodge Charger, driven by a neo-Nazi, raced through 4th Street Southwest, where both alt-right and counter-protesters faced off. The driver of the Dodge Charger intentionally struck pedestrians, sending them flying through the air. When the Charger ran into another vehicle, the driver put the car in reverse, struck more people before speeding away. He was arrested about a mile from the scene. After the attack, 19 people were sent to the hospital with injuries, and 5 of them were critical, though later testimony concluded 35 people were injured in the attack. 1 person was killed. 32-year-old paralegal Heather Heyer had attended the counter-protest with friends and was trying to cross the street to leave the protest when she was struck by the Dodge Charger. Heather was about stopping hatred, her mother said after Heather's death. Heather dedicated her life to standing up for those she felt were not being heard, her family and friends said. She died fighting for her beliefs and campaigning against hate. As for the offender, he had been drawing swastikas since middle school, was violent towards his paraplegic mother, and suffered from apparent mental health disorders. As I wrote this, I was trying not to sound all angels versus demons. I want to be unbiased. Heather probably wasn't an angel. We all have our faults. But she was a young woman who felt passionately about equality and attended the protests to show her support for equality. The offender was not a demon either. Rather, he was a troubled young man with a less than wonderful upbringing and probably didn't have anyone willing to lead him off the path of hate. He was a young man, and his hate got the best of him. Heather died, and a lot of people were injured, and the offender was charged with murder, assault, and multiple hate crimes, and received life without the possibility of parole, plus 419 years. All of this because his hate blinded him. Not surprisingly, all the alt-right groups in attendance distanced themselves from the offender and claimed he was not a member of any of their organizations, though the offender himself said he was a member of Vanguard America, a neo-Nazi organization. They also called Heather a fat communist or made up conspiracy theories about her death, all to take blame away from their cause. Richard Spencer, surprisingly enough, was the only one within those groups to come out and say that Heather's death was tragic and could not be forgiven. On August 15th, President Trump was asked to comment on the rally and the attack. His supporters cringed and many people got angry when he said that there were fine people on both sides. But to be fair, he did say, quote, "I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and white nationalists because they should be condemned totally." Like any politician, he was playing the field and didn't want to upset some of his supporters who supported the rally, but at the same time wanted to express condemnation of the attack. He could have chosen his words a little bit more carefully, or had a staffer prepare some for him. As for the city of Charlottesville, it rallied and renamed the street where the attack occurred as Honorary Heather Heyer Way. Spike Lee dedicated his film Black Klansman to Heather, and Heather's best friend released butterflies at her wedding to honor Heather and her fight against hate. After the chaos and tragedy of the Unite the Right rally, membership in various alt-right and hate groups declined, but extreme right-wing gatherings occurred in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, ran counter to the 2020 George Floyd protests, and came to a head on January 6, 2021, when the U.S. Capitol was attacked. And I'm referring to the people who actually stormed the Capitol and attacked police officers, and not the people who were peacefully protesting outside. Still, despite the best efforts of the alt-right, on April 1st, 2021, the Virginia Supreme Court overruled a lower court's ruling and proclaimed Charlottesville could remove the Robert E. Lee Monument. They did so on July 10th, 2021, in the early morning hours, under heavy police guard. I don't know what to make of President Trump's very fine people statement. I don't necessarily believe neo-Nazis are very fine people. All they do is spew the same old anti-Semitic hate and falsities that have been around for over 2,000 years. And can't these people think of anything original? And I'm not a fan of white supremacists either, or their misogynistic bullshit about white women needing to produce more white babies and white men are the only ones to protect them. Once again, same old song and dance that white supremacists have been preaching for centuries. A woman is only worthy when she bears white babies, and she is unclean if a black man touches her. That misogynistic, racist theory was the cause of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the reason 2 men killed Emmett Till. I also don't approve of violence being used by the extreme left either. Sure, okay, so you don't like fascists. Guess what? I don't either. But if history has taught us anything, it is that peaceful protests and civil disobedience accomplishes much more than violence ever has. Most people don't like it when you throw Molotov cocktails at city buildings, simply because our tax dollars have to be used in order to repair the damage that you caused. So thanks for that. Anyway, circling back to Hannah from Texas's suggestion that I talk about a crime that appeals to the historian in me. The death of Heather Heyer really upsets me, not only because she was killed by a man fueled by hate, but also because we never learn from history, and her death was sparked by the attempted removal of a statue. I've already addressed my opinion of statues, but as for history, perhaps if we opened the books a little bit more and learned about our own bloody past, we wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Maybe if we got over being uncomfortable about our nation's mistakes, we could better understand how history has shaped our country, and we can then move forward with a new legacy of acceptance rather than one of false narratives. Now, I don't know. I obviously don't have all the answers. And while at times, I admit I can act all righteous, I'm just as flawed of a person as anyone else, and I have a lot to learn about the world. During this episode, I wanted to explore several missing persons cases and murders in Virginia along U.S. Route 29, which stretches from Florida all the way to Maryland. It's also been known for a number of disappearances since 1996. And the following information came from lots of law enforcement sites, lots of news websites and articles, and also our favorite online encyclopedia. So there's this guy, Richard Mark Ivanitz, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, but honestly, I really don't care. He was a serial killer active in the area from 1996 until 2002. While it was never confirmed, Ivanitz was also suspected of being a killer known as the Route 29 Stalker. In hindsight, detectives had claimed that it was highly unlikely to have multiple offenders in one area at one time, which many of us true crime enthusiasts know that it's very much possible. I mean, look at California in the 1970s and 80s, or even Northern California. Ivanovitz was also involved in the murder of 3 girls from Spotsylvania County, Virginia, and the kidnapping and assault of a teenage girl in South Carolina. In addition, Ivanitz was also suspected of 2 rapes prior to his offenses in Spotsylvania County, though this was never confirmed. In June 2002, Ivanitz committed suicide while surrounded by police. The Route 29 Stalker was never caught nor identified after over 20 years. Police and investigators are still unsure whether the Route 29 Stalker was Ivanitz, the serial killer in the area around the time, or somebody else, or multiple persons. And here are just some of the cases that occurred on Route 29. Alicia Shoalwater Reynolds. Alicia disappeared on her drive to Charlottesville, Virginia, to shop with her mother in 1996. Sources say Reynolds never came home to her destination. Reynolds is thought to be the first of many disappearances along U.S. Route 29. Police claim Alicia's killer must have known the area in which her body was found. Her remains were found in what was said to be the middle of an isolated field that sources claim only a local could have known about in Culpeper County. Neighbors of the area say they only found the remains once they noticed vultures circling the area. However, the police stated that she was most likely murdered the day of her abduction. Originally, officials believe Alicia was the victim of Ivanitz. This was never confirmed, and her case still remains cold today. Julianne Williams and Laura Lawley Winans. Julianne, 24, and Lawley, 26, were both found dead at their campsite in Shenandoah National Park in May 1996. Both women had been sexually assaulted, and their case remains unsolved today. They have also been the subject of many documentaries and podcasts. Anne Caroline McDaniel. 20-year-old Anne was last seen leaving a group home in the town of Orange on September 18, 1996. Her burned remains were found 4 days later within just 10 miles of the location where Alicia had been found. Her case also remains unsolved. Morgan Dana Harrington, and I know that a lot of you are familiar with Morgan's case. Morgan was a 20-year-old college student at Virginia Tech when she disappeared from Charlottesville near John Paul Jones Arena while attending a Metallica concert on October 17, 2009. Her body was found at Anchorage Farm in Albemarle County months later on January 26, 2010. On September 15, 2015, Jesse Matthew was formally charged with first-degree murder and abduction with intent to defile in the murder of Morgan. Samantha Ann Clark. 19-year-old Samantha was last seen in Orange as well, shortly after midnight on September 13, 2010. On Friday, January 15, 2021, the Town of Orange Police Department reclassified her disappearance as murder due to the new information and advances in investigative and forensic technology. Samantha's missing person investigation has been reclassified as an active abduction and murder investigation, according to the OPD chief. Sage Smith, also known as Deshad and Unique, was a 19-year-old transgender woman last seen in Charlottesville on November 20th, 2012. waiting for a date very close to the location where another abduction victim's car was found in August 2013. Sage's case went cold and remains unsolved. Alexis Tiara Murphy. Alexis's abduction occurred on August 3, 2013, when the 17-year-old went missing after leaving her home in Shipman, reportedly heading to Lynchburg. She was last seen on security footage at a gas station in Livingston, Virginia, and her car was later found outside of a theater off of US 29 in Charlottesville. Her remains were discovered on private property on December 20th, 2020, and were positively identified by a Virginia crime lab on February 5th, 2021. Despite not knowing the location of Alexis's body until 2020, a suspect was taken into custody and charged with her abduction in 2013. Randy Taylor was later found guilty of first-degree murder in the commission of an abduction and abduction with intent to defile in connection with the disappearance of Alexis. The disappearance of Heather Graham occurred very early on the morning of September 13, 2014, when the 18-year-old University of Virginia student went missing and was last seen at the downtown mall in Charlottesville. On September 24, 2014, Jesse Matthew was arrested in Galveston County, Texas, while being wanted for the abduction and abduction with intent to defile Hannah. On October 18, 2014, Hannah's remains were found in an abandoned property in Albemarle County, Virginia. Jesse Matthew was scheduled to appear in court on December 4, 2014. Matthew entered an Alford plea and was sentenced to 3 life terms. Given the short time frame and similarities between the cases, specifically the small geographical region where they occurred and the age and gender of the victims, it is often wondered whether these cases are linked. The main suspect in Reynolds' disappearance is a man from Maryland named Darrell Rice, who people believe is the Route 29 stalker. Taylor, the man charged with the abduction of Murphy, was a friend of another victim and is known to have called her cell phone several times on the night of her disappearance, but has never been charged with anything in relation to her case. Despite many people suggesting Taylor was the Route 29 stalker, police have said there is nothing linking him to that case. And, as well, Taylor was in prison when Reynolds was killed. Jesse Matthew, the man arrested in the disappearance of Hannah Graham, has been linked forensically by DNA, suggesting he had some contact with Harrington on the night of her disappearance. At the request of Taylor's attorney, police tested Murphy's car and checked her social media history to see if she had any contact with Matthew. It's a lot of disappearances, and there's lots of suspects and lots of killers in these cases. It's possible they could have all been linked. It's very possible. But it's even more probable that there have been multiple killers in this area since 1996 and that are still there today. So I'm asking you, if you have any information about these cases or any other case along Route 29, please contact the FBI at 1-800-225-5324 or tips.fbi.gov. If you feel uncomfortable for any reason going to the authorities, you can contact me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. Someone out there knows something. You may not, but you may know people in Virginia who do. Share these cases with them. So that wraps up this episode. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to all of the new listeners out there. You guys are just magical. And I especially want to thank the folks from both Scotland and Australia. I love you guys too. I am truly touched. A lot of you have stuck around as I have experimented with my new platforms, or I don't want to say new platforms, but I have experimented with this platform and failed at keeping an episode schedule. I truly do, but life gets in the way, and at this moment I am experiencing bad internet connection, so I have no idea when I'm going to be able to upload this. Anyway, feel free to email me or follow me on Instagram. Maybe you'll get lucky and I'll start posting more pictures of dogs. I know a lot of you love dogs. So I am working on the next episodes. And I'm also working on getting some more guests on as well, because you guys really, really liked the episode with my friend Tom. Anywho, until then, do me a big favor. Take care of yourselves. And take care of each other. Later.